It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce Kath Bransby, who's going to talk to us about how, I was going to say parent friendly is Waldorf, or how Waldorf friendly are parents, or whichever way around she's going to choose to discuss that. Kath works for Waldorf UK, which is the organization that represents Steiner Waldorf schools in the United Kingdom. And she works in curriculum development and supporting schools and has done a huge amount of work in developing new curriculum, procedures, and so on to support schools in their endless challenges facing school inspections and so on. And in her other life, she's an academic. She's at the University of Sheffield Hallam, and she's recently conducted some research with parents. And she may flag this up later in her talk, but we've also co-authored a book which has just appeared, which I'm sure she'll plug as well. So thank you for joining us, and over to you, Kath.
Thanks, Martin. I totally forgot about plugging the book, actually. It's a good job you said it. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about the research that I did last year. I just wanted to very quickly introduce what kind of research it was, because I've realized quite recently that the research conventions and traditions in the UK are quite different to some of the rest of Europe, and I'd be interested to find out if that applies across the world. Um, so the research that I did is qualitative research. So if you're not familiar with the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, quantitative research works with numbers and statistics, and qualitative research is about words and experiences and finding meaning. So, to give you an illustration to make that clear, if you were researching teacher retention, so why do teachers leave the profession of teaching, for example, quite an urgent question for some of us sometimes. If you did a quantitative study, you might look at the data. So you might look in England, for example, after 5 years, only 67% of teaching graduates are still teaching, and it drops to only 57% after 10 years. So you would look at the numbers. If you did some qualitative research, you would try to find out why teachers are leaving. So you'd do interviews and you'd attempt to kind of understand teachers' experiences and their motivations. So the qualitative research that I did was a case study. So that's qualitative research, but on a small scale. That means that it's not generalizable to another case. And it's not even generalizable to theory. So you can't say, well, it happened here, so therefore it probably happens everywhere else. Really, it's just an exploration of one particular case, and that might or might not offer something interesting for people to think about, maybe to compare to their own case, their own setting. So that's a little bit of background to my research. What I'd like to do in this session is actually do a little bit of informal qualitative research as we go along. Um, I'm going to present some of the results of my case study, but I'd really like to try and gauge, understand how common some of these themes are around the world. But before I get into that, I'm going to ask you to imagine. So I would like you to imagine that you are a parent in 1919 in Stuttgart. You're a parent of a child in the first Waldorf school in Stuttgart. And I'd really like you to use the chat quite a bit today. If you can use the chat to to say something about what you think the pressures might have been on you as a parent in 1919 in Stuttgart. What might be the influences on you? What might be the pressures that you feel as a parent? Sarah said economic uncertainty. Alan said attitudes to the war. Yeah. Mainly working class, how to get food on the table, food, work, money, another war. Yeah. Christoph, there was not such a thing. Everything was chaos directly after the war, and school was an escape for the children. What's It's interesting to think about the parents who'll take care of my children while I'm out working for 14 hours. Yep. I want my child to have something different to me. Yeah, interesting. Girls and boys together. But the pressures on parents bringing two good meals onto the table, having more than three young children at one time, juggling connection and care, uncertainty of the future of the Republic. Yeah. Marty, good education is a luxury. Rubina, I love that feeling uncertain and afraid for my children whilst I'm exhausted and focused on survival. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my slides. And what I want to walk you through is some of the literature, some of the research that has been done into experiences, parents' experiences of being parents in the 21st century. So I want us to really start thinking about what is the wider context that parents today are living in. Parents are, first and foremost, parents are human beings. They live in a social, a cultural context that affects everything that they do. So I'd like to have a look at some of that writing. And most of the research that I'm drawing on is from the UK and North America, but there is some from Scandinavia. As I walk you through this research, I'd really like you to reflect on where and how and whether this resonates with you. Do you feel that there are similar trends and pressures and cultures wherever you are in the world? And it might also be helpful to think about whether any of this might have influenced parents in their choice of Waldorf education for their children. So, first of all, human life and society has changed more rapidly over the last 100 years than ever before in history. And that change has been even more rapid in the last 25 years. And inevitably, those changes have had an impact on parents and on parenting. And one example is that parenting has become a verb. So, parenting is something that we do rather than who we are. There have been huge changes to social structures. So, middle class women are more likely to work through their children's childhoods than they were before. Working class women have always worked through their children's childhoods, but it's changed for the middle classes. Childcare has become industrialized, it's moved out of the home. And in the home, there's been a move away from corporal punishment and authoritarian styles of discipline. Alongside that, there have been increases in the divorce rate, there have been decreases in family size, and we've had the digital revolution, the invention of the smartphone, and the introduction of that into children's lives at an ever earlier age. So, the research says that one of the key changes to thinking in the last few decades is that children's success is now believed to be determined by the actions of their parents. So, for example, it's accepted wisdom that children whose parents are more involved in school, children whose parents are aligned with the school's values, those children attain a higher level of educational achievement and progress. But this idea that your children's success is down to your dedication, your ambition as a parent, goes pretty much unchallenged in the wider culture. And we certainly see this in the state education system in the UK. So, for our early childhood settings in particular, are judged on how successful they are in engaging parents in their children's learning. But schools are also under this pressure. So we see it with the apps that schools use to communicate directly with parents and the expectation that parents will monitor and support children to do their homework, for example. That has really changed. A lot of the literature argues that a lot of these changes to parenting are linked to neoliberalism. So, neoliberalism is a highly contested term, but it's often associated with economic liberalisation policies, so privatisation, deregulation, depoliticisation, consumer choice, labour market flexibility, economic globalisation, free trade, austerity. It's about small government. So those policies are all designed to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and society. So neoliberal ideals include consumption. So the more you are able to consume and the more you are able to demonstrate that you consume, the higher your value to society and the higher your status. So success looks like a big house and an expensive car. And neoliberalism is competitive. Our success is judged on how well we've done in comparison to other people. And there is a lot of pressure to strive to attain perfection. Now, the impact of this on parenting is that in a neoliberal society, the adult's success or failure now includes their children's achievements. So your success as an adult is judged not only by what you achieve yourself, but how well your children do, what grades they get at school, what they achieve in their school leaving examinations, whether they go to a good university, whether they get a well-paid job, and all of the kind of markers of success, neoliberal success that come with that, the big house, the expensive car. And all of this pressure has created this significant change to how parents view their role and how they view their children. So a lot of researchers are arguing that child rearing is now seen by parents as a project. Parents see their role as a parent. Their role is to optimize their child's development at every stage and every aspect of their development, their social, their emotional, their physical, their academic development. Alongside that is a narrative that parenting is complex and difficult, and it requires a lot of expert advice and guidance. And that narrative is supported by an entire industry around parenting, an industry of equipment and gadgets to help your child eat and sleep and walk and talk, and books and courses and classes and endless social media about how to talk to your child, how to educate your child, how to support your child's development in every possible way. So, reviews of the literature show that a strong theme for parents is that they want their children to be happy. And some of the literature argues that happiness should be an aim of education. So, education should be about making children happy. And that's for a number of reasons, that because happiness improves academic outcomes, and happiness creates a kinder, more cohesive society. But other researchers argue that the pursuit of happiness is in itself a neoliberal ideal and it's saturated within individualistic values. Happiness assumes that individuals are able to control their own destiny and their own psychological state. And there's also criticism around what's called neoliberal feeling rules. So in a neoliberal society, we are required, if we are to be successful, we're required to display positivity, joy, and resilience at all times, and negative feelings are discouraged. So this researcher, Arthur Dotter, suggests that happiness as an ideal and these neoliberal feeling rules affect parents' perceptions of their children. So in her study, she writes about how contemporary parents talk about their children of vehicles of joy, vehicles of happiness. And then lastly, it's argued that in a neoliberal society, parents defer their own happiness. They put aside their own happiness in the pursuit of their children's happiness. So happiness is a huge theme. So, how are parents responding to this? At the beginning of the 21st century, there was a researcher called Annette Leroux, and she identified this phenomenon that she called concerted cultivation. And she wrote about middle class parents seeing their children as a developmental project and how these middle class parents worked to gain advantage for their child through providing lots of extracurricular activities, so music lessons and sports teams and chess clubs. And Leroux argued that this was because the middle class parents were suffering economic anxiety, that the decline of the manufacturing industries in the Western world was meaning that the fortunes of the middle classes were also declining. So parents felt that their children's job prospects were uncertain. So in order to get on, their child would need an advantage, some kind of advantage, and that could be given to them by the things that they did outside of school. The more recent literature talks about intensive parenting. So that's parenting with high levels of involvement, investment, and support. So intelligence and accomplishments are the goals of the project. So children can be healthy and happy and successful in the long term. So that the research says that parental anxiety is a major factor in driving this intensive style of parenting. Parents feel anxious about their children's futures, and so they engage in this kind of parenting. But it's also a vicious cycle because the pressure to be successful parents causes anxiety that drives the intensive parenting. But then the literature also has concerns about overparenting. So, overparenting is this idea that the overprotection of children from any risk of harm is actually leaving them very ill equipped to navigate adult life. So that there's research into hyperscheduling. So children are not left with any time to just be, to be bored, to play, to learn to entertain themselves. And then over involvement in education is having a really negative impact on children's motivation, their intrinsic motivation. And also that parental exhaustion and a lack of time as a family is causing poor mental health outcomes. So in the UK, there is the impact of class, social class, and socioeconomic status on educational choices and on long-term outcomes. It's very well documented. Michael Gove, who was the Secretary of State for Education from 2010 to 2014, famously said in a parliamentary inquiry that rich, thick kids, so rich, stupid kids, do better than poor, clever ones. Annette Leroux argued that families have different cultural logic, a different cultural logic of parenting that depends on their social class. So she suggested that poor families, working class families, allow natural growth. So they focus on meeting their children's basic physical and psychological needs, food, shelter, comfort. But wealthier parents use this concerted cultivation to maximize that success and happiness. But research that's more recent than that actually says that mothers of all classes are typically encouraging and supportive, keen for their children to achieve. But middle class parents are more likely to succeed in that mission. Not just because they have economic resources that give them a wider range of choices, but they have this class specific confidence. They have an ability to navigate the educational system and the dominant privileged culture. However, there is some evidence that different types of middle class families engage in this process of concerted cultivation in different ways. So, in the UK, in particular, there are economic markers of class. So, your class is determined by your income, your occupation, your job, your capital wealth, and your educational level. But there are also less quantifiable but equally significant markers of class that relate to cultural, social, and linguistic capital, cultural, social, and linguistic choices and tastes and aspects of your life. So in the 21st century, we have a different set of class labels that differentiate between the established middle classes, that's those people who have high status social networks, who tend to favour highbrow culture. So things like the theatre, art galleries, classical music, visiting stately homes, National Trust properties. And those established middle classes are differentiated from the technical middle classes and the new affluent workers who might have similar levels of economic capital but significantly lower social capital. So they engage in lowbrow or emerging cultural activities like going to the football, watching reality TV, going to theme parks, and listening to pop music. So I thought it might be interesting for you to find out what your social class would be in the UK. So you can use this QR code with your phone, and in a moment I will be able to post a link into the chat. And you don't have to share in the chat what class you are or would be in the UK, but I'd really like to know if this is if the results are surprising to you. It's quite an old survey, just to warn you. It doesn't work very well on a mobile phone screen. You'll have to turn it sideways, but if you're on a laptop, you can click the link in the chat. Oh, there are lots of poor people in the UK, Christoph. Lots and lots. And you can be poor and middle class. It's not determined by income. Um,
But are they also researched, the real poor ones?
yes, yes. The reason that I'm focused on middle class differences will become clear later, I promise. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen again before I ask you to use the chat again. It's going to be a little bit interactive today. Okay, so one of the really interesting things about this research in terms of parenting is that even within the middle class, or the middle classes, there are differences in what is valued and what's prioritized and the parenting strategies that are used. So, newly middle class families, so families who are economically reasonably wealthy but have low cultural capital, those families tend to prioritize academic results. So they develop their children by putting pressure on their children to complete homework, to achieve high grades. Families with high levels of cultural capital, so more likely to be the established middle classes, have a different approach that's been demonstrated to be more successful, and that's called academic socialization. So those established middle class families use their family time and their family discussions to create a positive attitude to education, to all of its institutions, and to teach and support their children to navigate the various different institutions. And then there are also differences depending on families' cultural heritage. So, middle class UK Black Caribbean families are more likely to use a strategic choice of high culture extracurricular activities. So, they encourage their children to take part in the kinds of cultural activities that very privileged white people engage in. Um, and they combine that with the pressure to excel. But the family conversations aren't around academic socialization. They're more likely to focus on Black identity and how to navigate a racially unequal society. So there's layers and layers of complexity in how cultural heritage and class situation influence parents' approaches to schooling, to education, and to the choices that they make about that education. So this is where the research starts to have an impact on school choice, and particularly on parents' willingness to choose a Waldorf school for their child. So, for less well-established middle-class families, so particularly if there are what the research calls undesired circumstances within living memory. So, within the living memory of the family, if there are experiences of hardship, real hardship, shortages of food, uncertain housing, that kind of thing, those less well-established middle-class families are less willing or they're unwilling to take educational success for granted. So they're more likely to consciously push their children to achieve those exam results, those university places, those well-paid jobs, to give them that security. It's a route out, it's a route away from potential poverty and undesired circumstances. But that means that they're probably less likely to choose a Waldorf school, where there's less of a focus on that academic success and the exam results. Established middle class families are much less likely to have anxiety about their child's long term educational and academic and economic success. They believe that their child will do just fine, and that belief is very well supported by the research. Middle class kids generally do well. But what the research also shows is that those established middle class families, they don't hesitate to intervene if a child isn't doing as well as expected. So they feel very capable of filling any gaps, of compensating for less successful teaching, for example, of paying for tutors if that's needed, so that children can pass the exams that they want or they need in order to do the next thing that they would like to do to take the next step in that journey. So there is an alternative approach to being a parent, and that's often described through a metaphor of gardening. So rather than attempting to shape the child into a predetermined outcome, parents focus on providing an optimal environment where each child can flourish in their own way. So this metaphor of the gardener parent has a very long history. It goes all the way back to Rousseau, but there's little to no literature that explores what this approach looks like in practice and what its impact is on children's development. So here is a bullet point list of a summary of all the things about parenting in the 21st century that I've just talked about. What I'd like you to do is use the chat to let me know where you are and what is familiar and what don't you recognize. Which of these themes feel that resonate for you? Which of these themes feel familiar in your context, and which things are unrecognizable? In the UK, we're quite concerned with social class, so that becomes a big theme in the research here that might not exist for you. This idea of children as projects and parents' success and failure, including their children's achievements, is that a phenomenon that you recognize and that you have seen in your schools, or is it not? I'm not going, I will keep my screen up just so that you can see all of that. In Holland, it's not so class driven, it's more general and mixed. Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that in the UK, most of the schools are parent funded has a huge impact. Children as projects and parenting being complex and difficult. Yeah, also the desire for happiness. Absolutely. Yeah. I like your long years of working with Waldorf parents, Marty. Yeah. All familiar in South Africa, in the middle class white families. Yeah. All too familiar. And teachers often have these beliefs. Interesting. Find it all in one class. Lovely. That's really interesting that this is all very familiar in Kenya as well. And Anthea, yeah. Steiner Waldorf parents differs if their parents are to school or a homeschool setting. There's some really interesting research around home education and why parents choose home education, and huge differences depending on whether it's seen to be a free choice or a forced choice because your child isn't able to be in a school or you feel like the education system doesn't offer what your child needs. Okay, so my case study, what I've just covered with you, it was the literature review or part of the literature review for my case study. My case study was called Why Waldorf? Um, and I set out to explore some of the factors that influence parents and carers to make and continue to make, to remake the choice of a Waldorf school for their children in the UK. And that is a very specific context because in the UK, we only have one state-funded Waldorf school. All the other schools are parent-funded, they're private schools. So there's a huge economic aspect to making the choice of a Waldorf school. But I really wanted to understand, I had some ideas, but I wanted to understand what the factors were. And I found this model. This is actually an immigration model, a migration model developed in the 1960s around push and pull factors. And I found this model really quite helpful in thinking about how parents make these choices. So if we think of mainstream state education as the kind of default option, the origin for families, because all children are entitled to a place in a state school, and that's the cultural logic, that's what most people do. So it has to be a very conscious choice not to choose state education for parents in the UK. So the parents start off a bit closer to that mainstream education destination. So Waldorf is a destination that parents might choose to migrate to, depending on the pull factors or the perceptions of pull factors, things that attract them in one direction or the other, and the push factors or parents' perceptions of push factors. So things that repel them from either of those two options. And then there are obstacles that might prevent them from moving in a particular direction. So in my research, I found three key pull factors or themes of pull factors that attracted parents to Waldorf education. The first was the environment. So that's the physical and the emotional environment of schools and kindergartens. This is what's called a word cloud. So the size of the word or the phrase represents how often it was used in survey responses. So I'm not going to do a whole section about research methods and methodologies, but the first part of my research was done through surveys. But those were open text surveys, so they asked parents to write freely about the reasons that they'd chosen a school for their children. So I did a thematic analysis, and these are the key themes. Parents talked about the natural environment, the beautiful natural resources, a connection to nature, but also a sense of calm and respect, and the space for children to be themselves, that it was warm, it was nurturing. The second pull factor was the educational approach. So having a broad curriculum, creativity, no screens was really interesting. That later start to formal learning. We have a very early start to formal learning in the UK. Children start full-time formal education aged 4. So the later start was a big factor. And then the third pull factor was around dispositions. So dispositions, ways of being, aspects of children and young people's characters. And what I found that was important for parents was that they had met Waldorf pupils. They'd either visited a school and met the pupils in the school, or they'd met Waldorf pupils elsewhere, or they'd met alumni. And they saw in those children and young people, they saw the kinds of dispositions that they wanted their children to develop. So it was all around being free thinking, having a love of learning, having curiosity, creativity, being independent, being imaginative, but it was also around well-being. So having good mental health was very important as well. The push factors that parents tend to focus on, and of course, I was only surveying and interviewing parents in Waldorf schools, so I didn't find out much about the push factors from Waldorf. But the push factors from state education, from mainstream education, the things that parents focused on were, as you might expect, kind of the opposite of the things that had attracted them to Waldorf education. So they saw mainstream education as being industrialized, impersonal, having a narrow curriculum, not enough time to play, particularly in the early years, and a lack of focus on children's well-being and a lack of emotional nurturing and warmth. But where my research got really interesting, I thought, was in comparing my results to the literature on parenting and on school choice. So this is where all of that literature about what it means to be a parent in the 21st century and the impact of being in a neoliberal society and the results from my own research started to intersect. So choosing a school for your child, particularly choosing an independent school, is seen as part of the intensive parenting phenomenon. So paying for your child's education is part of that intensive parenting. Parents are assumed, the vast majority of the literature says that parents will choose a school based on its academic outcomes. They will choose a school based on the level of advantage they can afford to purchase for their child. But the Waldorf parents didn't mention that at all. The Waldorf parents didn't mention any of the things associated with concerted cultivation. They didn't mention extracurricular activities, sports clubs, chess club. They didn't mention exam grades. They didn't mention the chance of going to a prestigious university or whether their child would go on to have a high status job. It was actually the opposite. Parents talked about education that is low stress, low pressure, education that's gentle and child focused and self-led. So the focus is on developing that intrinsic motivation and a love of learning and good mental health. The responses all tended to revolve around the different aspects of what in Waldorf education is considered to be a healthy childhood. So a developmentally appropriate curriculum and pedagogy, active learning, positive sensory experiences, a nurturing, beautiful, natural environment, good habits, good physical health, this holistic approach. So the one question I didn't ask participants in my research was about their social class. But looking at my results in relationship to the literature, it would seem to suggest that established middle class families are the most likely to be willing to take that perceived risk with their child's education. They're less likely to be concerned about exam results. They're more likely to be confident that their child will be economically okay. Whereas families whose middle classness is less well established, families who have that economic hardship within their family's living memory, are less likely, I would suggest, to be willing to take the risk of Waldorf, where those top exam results, that progress into a prestigious university, is not necessarily prioritized in the same way that it is in a typical independent school or in a mainstream school. So the results of my research did seem to align with this very small amount of work that has been done on this idea of parents as gardeners. So families who are focused on the creation of a beneficial environment where children and young people can develop these important skills and dispositions within a progressive educational framework. But what I did discover was that there actually was quite a significant amount of parental anxiety. And that parental anxiety was not driving the over-parenting or the concerted cultivation and the intensive parenting. But it was anxiety about whether this wonderful garden of Waldorf education that the parents had chosen and paid for their children, whether that garden would remain unpolluted by unhealthy factors. So the anxiety and the tension was within the school, within the Waldorf school, about whether parents and families' values were sufficiently aligned with each other and with the school's values. So I'll just read some of these quotes. I'm aware the text is a little bit small. So these are all direct quotes from parents. You get a lot of parents who are there who aren't really interested in Steiner. They end up in Steiner when they have absolutely no connection to any of the basic ideas there. I'm concerned by the not insignificant number of parents who have no real connection to the Waldorf system, but are there merely as an alternative to mainstream education. The schools are now marketed to attract children that can't handle government schools for whatever reason, for example, bad behaviour or learning difficulties. And then we've got classes of kids where all the boys are gaming heavily. What worries me about the school is it's not a true Waldorf school. I've spoken to many prospective parents and encouraged some and not so much for others. For the ones I'm not so sure about, I tell them it'd probably be great for your child, but not for you. And that anxiety about the alignment of values went in both directions. So there was anxiety from the other side of that tension. I was worried I might not fit in, as I'd met some very Steiner parents and I felt judged. There's just a kind of preciousness which I think is sometimes a bit too much. There are probably a few more people I give a wide berth to for their very diverse opinions from mine. Slightly strange culture, e.g., the way people dress, the style of the setting, the somewhat quasi-religious relationship some people have with Steiner. Was there going to be a prevalence of anti-vax ideas that would make for disharmony and conflict? I do feel like cracking out a can of Coke because I feel like, we're humans and we don't need to be perfect. So again, I'm going to ask you to use the chat. I'm really interested to find out whether these themes from my research in the UK might be echoed across Europe, across the rest of the world. I'd really like to know whether you recognise these pull factors, these push factors, whether you think that the same kinds of things attract parents to Waldorf education wherever you are in the world, and the same kinds of things push them away from the typical state education. I'd like to know if you recognise these gardener parents, if you recognise this phenomenon of parents who are not interested in concerted cultivation and intensive parenting, but who want their children to learn and develop in a very different kind of environment, a low stress, low pressure, gentle, child-focused environment, where the focus is around developing intrinsic motivation and a love of learning. And I'd like to know if you recognise this tension where parents really want to experience this alignment of values. They really want to keep the garden healthy. I'll just leave that up for a moment and then I'll stop my screen share. So Martin's quote, they want the garden to be healthy but not perfect. That's really interesting, Martin, and especially thinking about your context that you have a diverse alternative community that doesn't really match that middle class model, that's really interesting. And Sven, I think there are a lot of parents who want to be both gardeners and carpenters to cover all their options, and they want the school to do that too. Yeah. Yes, yeah, and it's a very conscious choice to enroll your child in a Waldorf school in the UK. But you also recognise the first question is, will my child have a disadvantage? Can they get their arbiter? Yeah. Performance and freedom that clash at some point. Absolutely. Yeah, and it changes in high school when parents start to get anxious about academic excellence. Yeah. Changes as students progress to upper school. And the perfect garden, that's recognizable to some people. Yeah. And an expectation that parents will have to supplement what children learn in a Waldorf school. So there's an expectation that the schools will fall short academically. That's really interesting, Elizabeth. Yeah, and that reality and the dogma that's unhealthy. Yeah. Changes between primary and middle grades happens, and that tension is the weeds. That's interesting. Yeah. Anna, that really resonates for you, I can see. Yeah, too many families that don't really want Waldorf. So I just wanted to finish before we go on to questions. Um, I think one of the things for me that's absolutely fascinating about working in Waldorf education is understanding that the families who have brought their children to the school have made such a conscious choice to do that. And when we think about the context that parents are a part of, when we think about the pressures of being a parent within a society and a culture that is probably fairly unhealthy for children and young people, probably really quite unhealthy for those parents, but it's a society and a context that measures success in that neoliberal way, that measures success by those external verifiers, the education, the university, the job, the house, the car. Um, Parents invest a huge amount of hope and trust in a Waldorf school. And teachers are human, and schools are incredibly complex organisms. So it's impossible for us to be perfect. But I think it can be really helpful for those of us when we're working within Waldorf education. It can be really helpful to try to understand those different perspectives and dynamics and influences that are happening within the parent body. I think it helps us as teachers, as parents ourselves, it helps to reflect on that. And it helps as a teacher if we can reflect, it helps us to respond with grace. It helps us to respond more authentically to the difficulties and the pressures that are bound to come our way over the years. I have made an online document with the references on if anybody's interested in reading any of the research that I made reference to. You can use the QR code and that will take you to a document. But I'll stop sharing and open up the floor for questions.
I think what would be of great interest is to see the cultural differences.
Mm.
Rubina
Ruby,
raised her hand, yeah, and may speak.
There we go. Figured it out. I guess my question is, what are Waldorf schools, educators? Yeah, I get a sense of like what is being asked for of us in relation to your research? Like, how could we change?
yeah, I think that's the next step, and I don't know yet. I think it's a starting point is always an awareness. Like, are we actually aware that all of these pressures and influences and cultural contexts are having an influence on the parents of the families of the schools that we work in? Because that's our starting point. And then we also need to think about how do we do more than say everyone's welcome? Because there's a huge difference, isn't there, between saying, well, everyone's welcome, anyone can make this choice, and knowing that actually that's not a completely free choice for a lot of families because of all these external pressures and influences. So, how can we make it a genuine, valid choice for a wider range of families from different backgrounds? I guess that's the next piece of research.
I think probably the single biggest factor in this question internationally is whether you have the opportunity of sending your children to Waldorf schools, which are partly or fully state funded.
Mm.
And the research on that between, for example, Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on, compared to other countries, is, I mean, all the other socioeconomic factors pale into insignificance if you simply can't afford the fees. Yeah. What's interesting is within those countries, why do people choose and why do people not choose in Finland or in Norway or the Netherlands? Yeah. Any more questions or comments? People would like to speak up? Please feel encouraged. Marty.
Yeah, as some of you already know, I have been working with parents for quite some years. I am one of the coordinators of the European Network for Steiner Waldorf parents as well, which is little known, but we are working on that. But the thing is also this question of what can we do as schools is that we are wonderful and we I think we all agree on that, but we also sell a bit of a pink cloud to parents sometimes because we want to have the number of children in our schools. It's important to us, especially if it's also about fees. The more children we get, the better the school can function in many countries. It's a fact. So we do sell something that looks incredibly good, and we are not that good in communicating that your child will not always be happy there, because a child that is always happy is not a healthy child, and that they have to go through all the ups and downs. And in all kinds of communication and everything that we work with, when we call ourselves child-centered education, that we explain what that means, that it does not mean that your child will be the one that the school is built for. It's a children-centered education, taking into account the developmental phases with all its ups and downs. And so I think this is something that we can do, that we work and communicate with parents, not educate them because that's looking down on them, but work with them and explain more than what we do now. So, yeah,
Thank you,
that's my
Marty.
comment.
So the pink cloud might have a gray lining. Yeah.
I think the even just understanding that there is this cultural context of neoliberal feeling rules and the pursuit of happiness being considered to be a good thing. There's a big difference, isn't there, between happiness and purposefulness and meaningfulness. And can we explain the difference between the two and make sure that parents understand that what we're aiming for is purposefulness and meaningfulness, not necessarily happiness, which is a bit more superficial. Yeah.
I have three yellow hands. I think the order was Shiva, Elizabeth, and then Ida. Shiva.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Kath. Glad to see you again after a lot of months. So yeah, one thing that resonates a lot with me is children who cannot be supported in mainstream schools are moving towards Waldorf schools. And off late, I see that it is the same trend in India because I keep talking to my friends and my ex-colleagues, and I also see the same thing. But it's almost like we are in a position where we can't support them, but we just take them in, and there's like so much injustice for the child. And I feel like where I struggle the most is to get the parent to understand that we want your child to learn here, but we can't do it by ourselves. Like, we need your support too. We have to do it together. And at some point, I have also mentioned to the school that we can't simply take the child in just because we feel like we can't say no. We really have to see if we can genuinely support the child in their learning journey. This is something that I see like a trend. It's almost like there's so much increase in children with learning needs, but no support whatsoever. And I just want to know in what way can we change this situation, because it is increasing and I don't see a way where it is going to change in the near future. But how do we support the parent, the child, and then ourselves as well as educators so that we don't feel like, oh my God, what am I doing here for the child? Going home and feeling resentful about ourselves and the work that we do with the children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
There's an interesting comment or question, really, in the chat from a perspective of Muslim parents, and a master thesis has been uploaded, which I haven't opened yet, but I think it's from Kalila Grundl on relationship of Islam and Waldorf education. But Elizabeth, I think, is the next one on my list, followed by Ida, and then Jan or Jan Bedberg. So, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I really appreciated what's been said so far in many different ways because it helps to differentiate what we see. I really like the idea of the pink cloud as well. But that, when you said it, it made me think of our sort of external, the way we present ourselves to the world. And my concern, I think I've probably mentioned it before in this circle, is, branding, marketing. Are we actually showing what we are, which is a really excellent education that can really lead to excellence in all kinds of ways, including academic success or satisfaction. But one of the comments that Kath brought up was, I'm not sure I can admit that I drink Coke, something like that, right? And that is a very common perception of Waldorf education, that you have to kind of drink the Kool-Aid, as we say. And that is a real concern to me, that we make sure that we have our feet on the ground and offer, and market ourselves truthfully, right? And marketing, I know, is not a great word in Waldorf circles, but we have to just be transparent, perhaps I should say that. Yeah, that's a big concern to me.
I think it is really linked to a sense of belonging. And the easiest way to create a sense of belonging for yourself. Somebody said, actually, Elizabeth, it was you, wasn't it, that the immigrant families choosing charter schools because they have a uniform, because that creates a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
But there's exactly the same, it's just an unwritten uniform and way of behaving that can exist within Waldorf education, which is, that you wear natural fibers and you don't drink Coke and your child doesn't have a logo on their t-shirt. These are all they're for good reason, but they're also signifiers of belonging. And we have to be careful that we don't make it very easy for people to feel like they belong by excluding other people who don't have the same signifiers. Because the quickest route to feeling like you belong is to create a wall and exclude other people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We need to break down the walls of Waldorf, I think. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Ida.
Yes. Yes. Marvelous talk, Kath. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. I want to suggest, and it's not a yes or no now, but to try on that you try on your argument without using neoliberalism. And it's actually connected to the marketing. Neoliberalism is used in so many ways by researchers, by practitioners, and by politicians. And I don't think you need it. So I want to suggest it to actually stay closer to the bone of your rationale.
Yeah, I think it was the literature that talks a lot about neoliberalism and the impact of neoliberalism on parenting. And I think it's the connection between economics and parenting, the influence of economics on parenting that makes that a theme. But yeah, and as I say, it's a very neoliberalism itself is very contested as a term, as a concept. Um, yeah, but it's definitely out there in the literature.
Yes, and we don't have to adopt what people put out since we are by ourselves, then also norming. And it's not just contested, but again, it's high inference. So we risk people thinking things that we don't mean, as the researchers themselves also run that risk. So it's a suggestion.
No, thank you. It's
Thank
a
you.
really good one. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk as well. I think I wanna yeah, Elizabeth already said like half of what I wanted to say about breaking down walls. So that really resonated with me. I think I'm also in that camp, but I also realize the struggle that might bring to the Waldorf community because I feel like how do we then deal with the traditionalists? Because I think the Waldorf movement is a very traditionalist one. And, you can't also just, tear something down without first knowing what you want to build up instead and how to integrate these, let's say, non-traditionalist parents that are definitely coming more and more. Like, that is a question I try to deal with every day. How do we integrate them in our Waldorf? For me, it's a kindergarten, but I imagine in school it might be even more difficult. How do we yeah how do we approach them? We can't we don't have the same basis in anthroposophy. We don't have basically any shared basis except common sense maybe and the best wishes for the child. But there's this huge gap between parents suddenly and expectations and also our abilities. So yeah, it's more like a, a very open question than a remark, but yeah.
Thank you. Shazar has put a hand.
Yes, I'll be very quick. A thought came to my mind, and maybe this can be considered as a question. Um, the fact that when a parent is paying towards that vision that Waldorf is presenting, do you not feel that the parent sometimes feels entitled to have the uh, narrative to be controlled by them in terms of the neoliberalism, the marketing, the emphasis of their choice? Because when they are making a conscious choice and taking that risk of paying it, I also feel that parents sometimes have that entitlement to make those tweaks and changes in the community and amongst the parents, which sometimes I have felt that there is divisiveness in within the parents who have certain grouping or certain ideologies which magnetize them towards each other and does create some sort of fracture in it too, which may become a difficult challenge for some school administrations. And that stress trickles down to the teachers as well. Because I do feel when you're buying into it, that means because we're paying for something, therefore we have a voice in it.
I think that's really interesting. And I think it's also, I think schools have to think about their responsibility to create a positive culture within the parent community and how schools do that. That's a really complex, I say like that that's a very simple thing. It's not. It's a very complex thing. But how can schools support their parent communities to be inclusive, to be welcoming, to not create those barriers and those feelings of pushing people away who don't quite fit in or who don't share some of the same values or choices. I think it really is something that we need to consider as schools. It's not just about parent education. How can we inform parents about the pedagogy and what we do within schools, but how can we create school communities where the parents and teachers are working in support of one another, and working together with the children, not the one child, but the children at the heart of that.
Before I ask Christoph to come in, there is a question or there's a comment in the chat wondering why no one has answered Jan's question. So we can maybe think about that after Christoph has spoken.
I need to find Jan's question first.
Yeah, maybe Jan should write it in the chat for us because some of us might have missed it. Christoph.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I liked it very much. In the beginning, you warned us that your research in the UK is different from others, and that's very true, in my opinion. So I was happy with what Ida said. To talk in academic research about education, about neoliberalism, is in Holland a no-go.
Interesting.
No-go. That's first. And Holland is a very open society. And if you talk about neoliberalism, we are not talking about families, but we are talking about economics. So that is very interesting to listen to. And then you know, what you said, there are Waldorf habits, natural fabrics, and what you wear or you not wear. I do not know how that is, but that is in Holland non-existing. This bubble does not exist anymore in Holland. And that is a wonderful thing. We are, in this respect, very common. But what was amazing for me was that you said that parents come with enormous trust to the Waldorf schools that we do not experience in Holland. We experience that they are highly demanding and highly critical. And I think that's good. But this aspect of trust you do not find in Dutch schools anymore. No. The parents are very keen if the education is okay and if there is peace in the school and if the school is more or less a Waldorf school. That is what is going on. And yeah, that I just wanted to share with you that it is we are not so far from each other in the UK and here in Holland. But this is a real cultural gap.
Yeah, a huge cultural gap. Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I think it's fascinating to do case study research, to look at a small case, but and to just say, what does this make you think of? What does this bring up for you? What resonates? What's the same? What's different? Yeah.
May I have also a question to you?
Of course.
In the nowadays, we see more and more that alumni who had a very good career in the school and have good feelings about their upbringing do not bring their own children to the Waldorf school anymore. And that is for me a riddle that I cannot solve till now. Do you have ideas about it?
I don't. I think because there are so few schools in the UK, it's quite difficult. We do have alumni who bring their children to Waldorf schools, but we don't have enough contact with alumni to know about the ones who don't. So, and it's like one of the huge gaps in my research is what about the parents who've maybe visited a Waldorf school but didn't choose Waldorf education for their child or their family? What were the push factors and the pull factors for them?
That would be very interesting, huh,
yes, it would be really interesting. More difficult to do the research, but really interesting.
Yeah.
I think one of the
Thank you.
things that this highlights is that, as I think we've said before, there is a real need to have comparative pedagogical study because the cultural differences probably even outweigh the pedagogical differences and perceptions of Waldorf or anthroposophy. Because in some Scandinavian countries where in some countries you have a very high percentage of alumni sending their children to Waldorf schools, Finland, for example, but in other countries like Sweden, you don't. And there are such different attitudes within society as to what the relationship to education is. And one of the major differences I think that we've just highlighted is that I don't get the impression that parents in the Netherlands are looking to be part of a community. They're looking for education of a particular kind. Whereas in Kath's study, this kind of identification of the school as a focus for community is much more in the foreground. And that's also an interesting cultural difference. Sven, I think you have to be one of the last ones to get to speak.
Yeah, Christoph's question has built me a nice bridge for my theme next week because I think I have a possible answer to this. I think it happens quite often that somebody who was a pupil themselves does consider sending their children to the school only to find that their children's main lesson books look almost identical to their own main lesson books from 25 or 30 years earlier. And the time when that was considered a good thing, I think, is past. And modern parents realize that that can't possibly be a desirable thing. So the relationship modern generations have to the concept of tradition is changing substantially compared to 50 or 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's almost certainly a factor in some places, in some countries. So, Kath, would you like to, do you have any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to round off with?
Jan has just put his question in the chat, and I think there's absolutely no way I could possibly answer it. Well, no way I could possibly answer it, never mind in 5 minutes. But I think it's a really interesting, it's a really key question, actually. It's the results of my research were actually this question: how do we integrate parents into a Waldorf school when there is some lack of alignment in their values or their parenting practices, etc. So how can we make everybody feel welcome and at home without losing our way, without losing what it is to be a Waldorf school? How can we stay true to what Waldorf is for us whilst also modernizing ourselves and going with the time? That's a quote from Jan's point, absolutely. And a comment from Sam, from what Sven just said, that Sam's had recent discussions with parents who are not happy if the school doesn't look and feel exactly how it did when they were parents. So I think there are two aspects of that.
Yeah, that happens also. Yeah.
Yes, Martin, this is Hannah.
Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me well?
We can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate and love what you are doing because I'm a mom and I love Waldorf. I do believe in Waldorf, but my experience as a parent was not that good. So I do believe the change will happen from within. And I love, again, when I read about anything that you write, to improve Waldorf. I don't like to say as a critique, as to improve what's happening in Waldorf. If I will add to this, I'm a teacher in the public school system in the United States, and this is my 26 years in the state. And sincerely, we accept all the children who comes to our schools. And I cannot say enough how this built my stamina as a teacher to be diverse, to be open-minded, to know the skills for what the teachers, for unique learners in our classrooms need without having this, because it's by law. If they got it, they will get it, and by law, I have to apply it. So I do this as part of my teaching. Um, I know this is the end of the time, and I sincerely need more to people like you. I was happy to see you, today, honestly. And I love when I see you, I feel like I belong. I don't like to be, criticizing or having bad vibes when I say that, but sincerely because I can see you are a person who are look deeply in what's Waldorf and what's happening and what needs to be done. And I will stop at this point.
Thank you, Hala. I think that's a very nice way to round off this session. The importance of research to back up our intuitions and understandings about how Waldorf is, how Waldorf is perceived, how Waldorf wishes to be seen, and all the various layers of that, which in this sequence of talks we've been addressing. So I thought that was very helpful to have this view, whether we can identify with parents like the ones that Kath described, whether we can identify with the social class structures that we've been offered and so on. I think that's a very interesting question. So I think we can round up here. Thank Kath very much for making this very lucid and clear presentation for us. And we look forward to next week's talk from Sven. And I think Jost will be back in the chair here, as far as I know. Yeah. So, good morning, good evening, goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah.
And good night.
And good night.
Thank you.